one of the most amazing elephants that we've had around here in months to come. And well, now we've been watching him now 2 drives, yesterday afternoon and this morning, and I think we are just as in awe of him as all the females and the youngsters are, the way they seem to come along and look at him and revere him. He's a giant of an elephant. He's not a very big tusker, but he's a very tall, big elephant. And we are here on the open area near camp, and I hear a chopper taking off. Make a noise. Let's see what he does. This is going to be very interesting. There's a helicopter that has been here at the lodge, probably come in to fetch guests or drop off guests, or it could be something entirely different. But what's interesting is that helicopters have been used in the park for many years for various different things, including game capture exercises, but more specifically, on a very negative note, unfortunately, back in the 80s, helicopters were used when elephant populations were very high, and there was a decision made to cull elephants. And as sad as that may sound, that is what was done back in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, and elephants got to know about these things. And this is an elephant that would have been even an adult back in the 70s and 80s, or at least a young adult, and he would have known about it, because what was amazing was in those days when there was culling done in Kruger, when that helicopter took off, elephants passed on the message through their infrasound throughout the population, and that message would be sent, and it was noted that there was a change in elephant behavior even as far away as several hundred kilometers as soon as the chopper was in the air. And perhaps the fact that there hasn't been any culling for over a decade or more, no, maybe 2 decades now, might be an indication of the fact that he's not even reacting to the sound of this helicopter. I suppose more importantly, he's not even reacting to our presence. This is a big elephant bull. He's in must. Sorry, we're going to just move a little forward and watch him. He's under a big marula tree, a beautiful big marula tree. So let's go around this bush willow, get him from the front. Yeah, he is reacting. Look at that. He doesn't like it at all. Sorry, had this big bush willow in the way. He ran away a little bit. He watched where the helicopter was going, and he turned around and he came back. But boy, was that interesting. It's the first time I've actually been with an elephant, with a helicopter taking off. He didn't like it at all. What is more amazing is that he's letting us be here. As he knows that humans operate heli. He knows exactly what's going on, and yet he seems to be fine. We've suddenly gotten downwind of him, and we're picking up his must smell. Wow. He still remembers those days of the helicopters. Now, it was from those days when elephant calves would be spared. Well, it was sad though, because they might have been spared the cull, but they weren't spared the trauma. And they went through the most incredible trauma to be captured and kept in bomas until there were enough of them to translocate. And of course, not as much was understood about elephants. In fact, there weren't that many people that had the passion for elephants in those days. And it was thought that, well, they could collect 20 calves and then reintroduce elephants to areas where they'd become extinct. And yes, the intention was very good. Make no mistake. The intention was to repopulate areas that had been reclaimed from farmland, areas that had been turned back into wilderness, or rather wildlife areas. And of course, it'll never be wilderness, but areas that that authorities were hoping to re-establish elephant populations, and they thought, well, let's just take all the babies and put them there. And it was a case of just putting a bunch of children in a place without adult supervision, and the result of that was several years later these young elephant bulls were growing up without the guidance of older bulls, without the guidance of their mothers, without the discipline, I think more importantly, without the discipline in elephant society. And when they started coming into must and they started getting a little bit more aggressive, they started taking it out on things like rhino, and I think maybe the odd buffalo, but mostly the rhino. And there was a period of time, I think it was the late 80s, going into the early 90s, and into the mid 90s, that many rhino were actually gored to death by these elephant bulls that had no discipline and that had no control. And one of the things that managed to stop the whole process was the introduction of adult bulls, but also it was decided to spend a bit of money and actually translocate whole breeding herds rather than just calves. And nowadays, perhaps a lesson learnt, nowadays the only viable way to repopulate an area is to take a whole herd of elephants rather than individuals. Of course, it becomes logistically a nightmare and financially exorbitant. But so many areas now have been repopulated with elephants, successfully so, that elephants have got a far greater range than they did have 10 or 20 or even 30 years ago. Lessons learned. You know, in the early days of game capture alone, let alone for elephants, but in simple game capture, when before even the advent of darting drugs that affected the nervous system, that allowed people to get up close to animals and load them onto vehicles. It was a case of herding animals into bomas and putting them through so much stress. And then came the age of drugs, and unfortunately in the trials of finding out which drugs were best and what the doses were, there were losses. There were invariably losses. A lot of the losses occurred through what we call capture myopathy, which was they classified it as a disease, I think, but it was a stress disease that was brought about by the stress caused through game capture. And so many animals died from this kind of this severe stress that they were put through. And it was through trial and error and through learning and through understanding, and also perhaps a little bit more so through a little bit of compassion, that people started realizing that you can't just drug an animal, put it in a box and take it somewhere else. There's a lot that has to be done to make this animal comfortable and to minimize the amount of stress that and human contact that these animals have. It's still a very big business, big industry, game capture and translocating of animals, moving animals around from private properties to other private properties, areas that are perhaps enclosed, self-contained, that don't have predators, that don't have the option of allowing nature to take its course, where habitat management is perhaps almost as intense as in a zoo, or rather a safari park. Even though you might have an area of 10,000 hectares, which is about 20 to 25,000 acres, there is still critical habitat management needed in an enclosed area. You still have what we call a carrying capacity for different species. You have to calculate let's put it this way, you have to calculate the available vegetation versus the species you want to carry, and work out how many of that particular species that habitat could safely carry without overutilization and without any predators, because a lot of these areas don't have predators, there is always an excess of animals that have to be moved off every year, and this is where all the game auctions come in. And well, I suppose as with anything in the human world, it opens it up for exploitation, but generally it's a very decent and a very important industry. Being able to move animals around the country to areas where they once belonged and they no longer occur, maybe as a result of farming or agriculture, as a result of those areas reverting back to the natural wild, and farmers deciding to go back into wildlife and into perhaps tourism rather than engaging or fighting the elements trying to farm something. In many areas it's been proven that there's a far greater return per hectare with areas under wildlife, photographic tourism that sustains that wildlife. There's a far greater return than any form of farming or agriculture on a per hectare basis, and that in itself has prompted a lot of farmers to go back to game farming. I think the next step from there, once they learn that is a good, or once they realize how good that is to start developing conservancies, joining up with their neighbors and creating these very large conservation areas that we call conservancies, and declaring them private nature reserves, where several farmers will get together and remove their internal fencing, and they will create a much larger area where they will be able to hold perhaps greater numbers but also a greater diversity of wildlife. And nature has proved to us how resilient it is in restoring itself once it's left to its own devices. Now the Sabi Sand is one of those places, and it was probably one of the first private game reserves that was established back in the 50s, where all the landowners within the Sabi Sand decided, we'd have a far greater chance at giving wildlife what it needs if we didn't have our own little petty personal politics amongst the landowners, and dropped the fences, created a perimeter fence, and instead of a 1,000 hectare farm and a 6,000 hectare farm or a 10,000 hectare farm all buffering each other, they dropped the internal fences, created a 56,000 hectare reserve, and that is what became the Sabi Sand. Time moved on, and back in the 90s, eventually the Kruger Park fence was removed and the Sabi Sand was incorporated into Kruger. So now the Sabi Sand is part of millions of hectares, and now very little habitat management is needed. Very little, in fact almost no control is needed over the numbers of animals that occur here. The only thing that needs to be controlled perhaps is the habitat. And in areas where the grasses grow too thick and too dense, sometimes it's necessary to induce controlled burns to reset the balance, to reset, not so much the balance, but to reset the sequence of plants, from your pioneers to your climaxes. And eventually it gets too dry and too moribund and too thick, and no light, no air, no new growth can occur. And after 5 to 10 years it's sometimes necessary to have a burn. And as much as I know the owners, and as much as I know it's not going to happen here, but there are areas here on Djuma that perhaps could benefit from a burn. There's a very gentle elephant. He's in full must. We're getting the must smell from him. There's a bit of a breeze blowing our way. It's very still, but there's still air movement that's coming our way. Very strong smell. And for an elephant in must who's got heightened testosterone levels, he's a wonderful bull to allow us to sit here and watch him. I'll probably be going through the photographs of elephant bulls that I have from home and to see if I've ever seen